Welcome back. Welcome in. This is Country Roads Confidential at earsports.com, a CBS sports podcast. I am Mike Casaza, back with a special edition. It's that time of year, West Virginia basketball kind of percolating here on the front burner. Everybody's looking at it, trying to figure out what to think of it. We've been down this road before. We know this story. We don't know how it ends, though. So I need help. I need predictive analytics. Very popular guest back, Evan Miyakawa. You know him from EVANMIYA.com, evanmia.com. Evan, welcome back. I look forward to you telling the future right now.
Thanks, Mike. It's always good to be on with you, and you are as knowledgeable as they come. And I really enjoy talking basketball. So let's do it.
All right. Well, thanks by saying I'm knowledgeable, because I'm going to have you add to my base here. You knew a lot about what this West Virginia roster was going to be before we all did. And that's the nature of your analytics. And I said the predictive functions, which I think a lot of people have come to find to be very valuable. Here we are. This West Virginia team has gotten through non-conference play, I would say pretty impressively. You could look at KenPom ratings, the net, if you still believe in RPI and Sagarin, up, 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 up. For a lot of people, it's not a surprise because it's not a great schedule. But for a lot of people, it is a surprise because things went so poorly last season. I kind of used you as a guide when they were putting together their transfer portal class because you liked a lot of players absent the public support of that. Most notably, I would say Joe Toussaint, but other pieces you saw fitting and you saw that this could work out here. Here we are again through the non-conference. Things look very good, and you were right on this. What was the motivation for your optimism that has ultimately borne out to be true here?
Yeah, West Virginia, their transfer class in particular, I think is the biggest storyline for me. And like you noted, I have transfer portal class rankings and individual player projections on my website. And a lot of coaches are using it, including people on staff at West Virginia. A lot of credit, obviously, to Coach Huggins. I also talked to Jay Kuhn, so I know you've had on this podcast previously. I talked to him a fair amount. I know that he's really plugged into my projections, as well as lots of other resources that he has available to him. But really what it comes down to is when I'm trying to project impact for a player who's leaving one team and going to another team, right? It's a little bit hard to like just straight up project stats. You know, if a guy averaged 20 points per game at a really bad school and then he's, coming to West Virginia, like you can't expect that to be the same. So it's pretty complicated trying to figure out like without context neutral evaluations of players, right? And so what my transfer portal rankings do is they basically try and project, regardless of what team a player is playing for, what is their just generic value or impact that they are projected to bring to a team on the offensive end and on the defensive end. And there's a lot of different ways of measuring that. And there's a lot of factors that go into kind of that transfer evaluation for each player. A lot of it has to do with, individual stats, advanced efficiency metrics, but as well as things like when they are on the court, how well is their team playing, and adjusting for things like other teammates that they're on the floor with, as well as the like individual opponent players that they were matched up with on every possession, and trying to adjust for that. So a guy like Joe Toussaint is a great example of this. I don't think a lot of people really thought that he was going to be like a top transfer. And I think he was definitely an underrated piece for Iowa last year. But he was ranked in my transfer portal rankings. He was ranked 14th best in the country, which was high for a lot of people. But a lot of that was based not just on his individual scoring ability, but just in the way that last year he really impacted and elevated Iowa's game when he was on the floor, both from a statistical lens and the way that he facilitated the offense, but also in the way that just how well the team performed with him on the court, adjusting for all of those variables, as I mentioned before. And so then translating that to West Virginia, he was expected to be really good. And so far he's been that. I think it's really interesting to look at, minutes allocation for this team. I think Coach Huggins is really allowing a lot of guys to play a lot of minutes and sort of figuring out what this roster is. So guys like Joe Toussaint have had an opportunity to really show what he's worth. And, for what it's worth right now, like he's ranked top 25 in the nation in Bayesian performance rating, which is my metric that quantifies overall player impact or value. And a lot of that, does come from that. There's still a heavy, preseason bias or projection to that, but like he's already grown in that rating from where he was. So he's already like outperformed so far. in terms of both his stats and his impact on team performance. He's already outperformed what he was thought to be. And if you look at West Virginia overall, they have five top 250 players in the country in this metric, and four of them are transfers. So that's a huge credit to the coaching staff for putting this roster together and already getting them to gel as well as they have.
Why do you think this has worked as well as it has? Because these are not players who were really celebrated college players. A couple of it bounced around. Maybe they hadn't been in the right system. It could be that West Virginia was the right place for them, but that also means that they saw something that maybe the public or the media didn't know. But you mentioned four players, top 250 are all from the transfer portal. That's four hits, which is pretty good. And that's unusual when you look at a quantity quality match like that, too. Whether it's Toussaint, Eric Stevenson, Trey Mitchell, Emmett Matthews, it's a weird amalgamation, but it did work. How do you think you can explain that, or do the Mountaineers explain that?
Yeah, I don't think I have a full answer for that. Obviously, like it's hard to tell. You can evaluate one single player, but knowing how an entire group of players, especially new players, is going to gel, that's difficult. But I mean, you can point to their experience. All of those guys are, they're in their fourth year of playing at least. And so that experience, if you're bringing in a guy from another school who's had that much experience, that does count for something. And I think that is a huge part of, like, if you're taking a risk, let's face it, when you're getting a transfer, especially with how many transfers there are in the portal and how many guys are getting interest from other coaching staffs, you have to move on these guys somewhat quickly. And the amount of scouting that you can do is obviously like way less than you're doing at the high school level typically for guys that you've been recruiting for years. So there is a level of risk, and you see guys who transfer and then 3 weeks into the season want to transfer again. It just didn't work. So when you point to things like, okay, what is going to guarantee the highest, possible success rate for these transfers? Number one, you can look at things like the tools I offer for projecting impact that are not biased towards, other people's opinions or eye tests of them. It's very, most rankings of anything you see by journalists are all going to be somewhat groupthink. People tend to think similarly, and my computer rankings are completely unbiased in that perspective, so it's a really helpful reference tool in that way. But two, like, just bringing in guys who are experienced already, that level of maturity is always going to make a big difference, and that does go into like a player's amount of experience does go into these transfer portal rankings for players that I put out there. But also, it's just a good principle in mind that you're more likely to have a guy be what you think he's going to be, and bring that maturity level when he does have experience. So I do think that's a big piece.
Here with Evan Miyakawa from evanmia.com, also a data scientist with Zealous Analytics. We'll get into that because that's pretty interesting here before we go. Stick with the Mountaineers, though. They're better. We understand that. You've kind of gotten to some of the projections that you made there, too, but you also have done some homework on this, and you know a little bit more based on what's behind the numbers and what goes into them. Explain this to me then, maybe without the transfer success as it, but where have they risen? Where have they succeeded this year? That does explain the improvement, and maybe moving forward, why there's an optimism that this is not going to crumble like it did last season.
Yeah, you mentioned last season. I think when we recorded a podcast last year, it was early January, and they had started to already slide a little bit. But at this time last year, like the end of December, they still only had one loss, and there was a lot of optimism in that team as well. I think part of the difference was that last year there was a higher expectation for that team overall in terms of where they were going to finish in the Big 12, looking for a tournament berth. And so I think this year has been like more of a surprise, partly because of all the new pieces. People just haven't really known exactly what to expect from this team. They started 70th in the preseason at my site and are already up to 29th. You'll see them even higher in other metrics like KenPom. I think they're 17th. Part of the reason they're a little bit lower in mine is that I always keep in a healthy amount of preseason projection for a team, partly because it ends up being more predictive of future success, especially come tournament time. Whereas like Ken Pomeroy, he, by the time you get to February, March, there is like no preseason bias baked in there whatsoever, partly because, the selection committee is using Ken Pom as a resume tool. And so it'd be unfair to, keep those preseason projections in there. But for me, I've found that to be more helpful in predicting future team success. So maybe 29th in the country is a little bit more of a healthy outlook on this team going forward than saying they're a top 20 team. But when you look at how much they've improved, I was just looking at this of all of the teams in terms of how much they've improved in their overall team rating at my site since the preseason. They're the eighth most improved team in the country. And they're the of all the teams that are like in the tournament conversation right now as an at large, they are the only team besides UConn who has improved this much. So really, really impressive what they've done. And I think when you look at some of the differences from last year, I think when you looked at the end of the year last year, they just weren't. West Virginia just wasn't really good at any one thing in particular. They were outside the top 60 overall. They didn't have a top 60 offense or defense. Whereas this year, like their offense is just a lot better. Obviously, their defense is a little bit better too, but they're top 25 in offense at my site. They're fourth overall in the Big 12, besides the big three of Kansas, Texas, and Baylor. You know, preseason, I don't think a lot of people really had an idea of like there was a big mix of teams past that top three. And who is going to be kind of in that fourth, fifth spot. West Virginia, I think, has taken that, at least for now. That's kind of their spot to hold. And their resume has been really impressive. They're ninth overall in the country in my like resume rank. And that's without even like huge statement wins. Their best wins are over, Florida, who's the top 35, UAB top 45. But their losses are respectable. Purdue and Xavier, nothing to scoff at all. And they've really just handled the teams that they're supposed to handle really well. And you look at a win like against Florida, they won by 30 points, and they had that game handled, way before the end of the game. So I'm really, optimistic about what they're going to do going forward. I don't necessarily think that they're going to. I think we're going to see a little bit of a drop off just purely because we're entering the onslaught of the Big 12. But, anything can happen, obviously. And there's a little bit of a PTSD potentially from West Virginia fans in terms of like, okay, well, let's wait till we get to Big 12 play because last year we just got slaughtered. But this year, I think there should be more optimism that they're going to, hold their own and be, hopefully at least looking to finish 500 in the Big 12, if not better.
Let's talk about what comes ahead here, though, too. I think someone can look at these numbers and kind of be skeptical that, wow, a Huggins team doesn't often score this easily, this often. High scoring offense right now. Conversely, they typically don't give up points in a field goal percentage or defensive rebounds as often as this team does here. So maybe the offense comes back to earth a little bit. Maybe the defense gets better. And this may be hard for you to answer, but are there positive trends that could continue? Are there positive trends that might come back to earth? And conversely, are there things that perhaps don't work well that could get better, and things that you might feel down about that might lift the team's head up later on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind in sort of answering this question is I think the coaching staff has given themselves a lot of flexibility in how they are going to employ lineups and players going forward. Because as I mentioned before, they're giving a lot of players a lot of minutes on this team, and they've still been really successful. And so I think that has allowed for them to have some wiggle room in terms of like, as we get into crunch time, as we get into Big 12 play towards March, when games are really mattering, it's life or death, who are going to be the guys that we rely on? And I think right now that's still an open question. And I think that's a good thing for this team because it gives them, they're not locked into any one thing. Emmett Matthews is the only team on the player on the team who's averaging over 30 minutes per game. The rest are at or under 25 minutes per game. And so, you can look at guys like, I mentioned they had 5 top 250 players in Bayesian performance rating, which measures overall player impact. And typically that's what I use as a guide for, in general, who should be playing more. You've got Joe Toussaint, Trey Mitchell, Kadrian Johnson, Eric Stevenson, and Emmett Matthews all in that category. And they're, all getting a healthy amount of minutes, but all could be flexed more. And then you have guys who aren't playing quite as much, but have demonstrated a lot of impact when they've been on the court. So, one interesting case here is Mohamed Wagi. He is, one of the rotation players on this team. But something to keep an eye on here, really interesting trend that I'm curious to see will continue. I have a metric on my site for players called adjusted team offensive efficiency. So that measures when a player is on the court, how well is a team playing offensively per 100 possessions when they're on the floor, and that's adjusted for the opponent quality that that individual player faces when they're on their court. Mohamed Wagi, when he is on the floor, he leads the entire country in this metric at 133 points per 100 possessions. So for all players who have played over 150 possessions, um, which is a pretty reasonable like low mark for a filter here, he's the best in the country. And to put it another way, when he's on the floor, West Virginia is at 24 points per 100 possessions better offensively when on the court. In a 70 possession game, that translates to like 16, 17 points better offensively per game if he were to like play the entire time. That's not meant to be a predictive stat, but it is a factor into Bayesian performance rating, and certainly something to keep an eye on when he's been on the court. I mean, he's shooting almost 80% from the floor. So, you might have guys like him who, over the course of Big 12 play, continue to prove themselves and can get more minutes. And so this coaching staff, I think, should be really excited about all the possibilities ahead of them in terms of figuring out who their core group of guys are. And so I'm really excited to see how this plays out for them as they head into Big 12 play.
You ready for some speed round? I bounce some players off you. You give me some thumbnails.
Let's go.
All right. I'm going to go a little obtuse here, though. Jose Perez, not eligible this season, but high scoring guard, 6'5", 19 points a game, assists, rebounds. Manhattan College, the MAC, not the Big 12, but has some experience at Marquette, Gardner-Webb. We don't know, and this is kind of unfair to ask you, but it's a what might have been right now. Like what might have been if you plugged him into this backcourt and this offense, which can do transition, which can score, which could use a passing guard, that 6'5" and get at the spots. But any feel for what he might have been or what his fit, I don't know, could potentially still be if he does get eligible based on his past and where he's been and what your numbers say.
Yeah, so really interesting one there. I think you can't not be excited about a player who transferred to your school after being the like conference player of the year, right? A preseason conference player of the year for that conference. But I am not actually convinced from an analytics perspective that he would have added that much to this team this year. Obviously, you never know. But just at looking at what his transfer portal ranking, projection would have been if he were in the portal from a slightly earlier period when I was tracking this during the summer, he would not have evaluated that well compared to the rest of the guys that West Virginia brought in. I think he would have been worse than most, if not all, the players that they brought in the portal this year, which is kind of surprising. But he obviously like put up good numbers at Manhattan. But I think when you look at the quality of opposition that he was playing, as well as his like individual efficiency numbers and how well he was impacting the team from a play-by-play perspective in terms of how well the team was playing, none of those things really led for my my analytics model for transfers to think that he was going to add that much. So I actually don't think that my evaluation of West Virginia as a team would have changed that much if he were eligible this year. That doesn't mean that he can't be a great piece for them going forward, but I don't see that from a numbers perspective, at least, as being quite as big of a what if as it could have been.
All right, I love it. You're not pandering, obviously, so that's a perfect answer. That's fine. You started the movement last year, the Kobe tribe. Probably should have played more. Very efficient player, small doses but productive. But Kobe Johnson back at it again. And his numbers are maybe because of playing time are not as impressive, but he's still an important player for what they want to do. And he may have a big role now, especially without Perez and Emmett Matthews out for we'll see how long. But he does have this going in the right direction, the similar direction too.
Yeah, I think, I've always been more impressed with his defensive game and impact. And, when you look at how West Virginia is playing while he's on the floor this year on a defensive perspective, it's definitely good. I think there are questions this year, though, about, offensively what he brings to the table. Right now, if you look at this season and you look at, each player's, how well the team is playing when offensively when they're on the floor, I'm just checking this right now. Yeah, his on-off numbers offensively, again, we're still relatively early in the season and he hasn't been playing starter minutes, so there's a lot still to be determined there. But so far this year, West Virginia is 25 points per 100 possessions worse offensively when he's on the floor. So that's a little bit concerning. And then when you look at his offensive stats, they don't necessarily jump off the page either. So a lot still to be determined there, and I would love to see that improve. Certainly, I love him as a defensive player, and analytically, that's also shown that he's already having a big impact for West Virginia. I think he ranks fourth in the team right now in defensive BPR. So that's kind of, predicting forward how impactful each player is defensively. So he's right there with the rest of them. I think offensively is a little bit more of the question.
Okay. I would imagine that the defensive reputation for Seth Wilson is not necessarily great. Curious about what the offensive performance says for him because he seems to be a volume shooter. He's going to get some shots when he's in there. He can make some threes. He's got like a funky mid-range game, but which again on a piece of paper doesn't look any different than a great mid-range game or a great 2-point game. But and again, another player who may be in line for significant minutes at two guard here just because they didn't get Perez. What do we think about Seth Wilson?
Yeah, solid piece in Wilson. Just looking at his profile right now on my website, he's eighth overall in BPR. So, solid rotation piece there. Like you said, offensively, that's more of his game. He ranks sixth or seventh, I think, on the team in offense. But the defense is the part that leaves more to be desired. He's last on the team in defensive BPR. And when you look at both his stats and how well the team's been playing, like there's not really a lot to refute that there. But like you said, a player similar to Kobe Johnson who has gotten some minutes, has a lot more opportunity to show more. And as I mentioned before, like they have this flexibility that they can, move players around, try, certain players or rotations more or less going into Big 12 play. So, pieces like both of those, I think, there's still a lot to be answered there. No conclusions so far in terms of, which players should definitively be like the players that they are riding on the most. So I would love to see him, contribute even more going forward.
Okay, you mentioned the stat that I'm sure a lot of people are going to pluck and copy and present as their own right now about Muhammad Wagi. Jimmy Bell's their minutes eater right now, and they had three bigs they were going to play. Who knows how often? Split them up into thirds, one more than the other. He's really taken over, and I don't know what they have here, and I don't know if they knew what they have. Here's a guy who's just physically completely different. He's lost 80 pounds, Evan. He can handle the minutes, and now he's figuring out how to score. Doesn't take a lot of shots. Doesn't miss many shots. Rebounding a little bit. I think he's probably part of their issue on ball screens through no fault of his own. It's just hard for him to hedge and do a lot of that stuff. But he's in line for a lot of minutes now because of the way he's performed. What can they expect there?
Yeah, Jimmy Bell's an interesting one because, like you said, he has played a lot and he's been in some of their most used lineups. Interestingly enough, though, like when I was just looking at West Virginia's top 5-man lineups, and there's I think 6 of them who have been the most used, over 20 possessions each, including the most used lineup of Bell, Johnson, Matthews, Mitchell, and Stevenson. Those are just listed in alphabetical order there. All of the lineups that have done the best for them have been the ones with Jimmy Bell absent from it, which I find kind of interesting. So that's a little bit, that's a trend to monitor going forward there. They just haven't had any 5-man lineups with him there that have been super effective, that they've run a lot. The best one that he's been in has been the lineup of him, Matthews, Mitchell, Stevenson, and Toussaint. That's been a pretty good lineup, but not that played that much, just 15 possessions on the season, which again, that's a pretty small size for a lineup there. So that'll be interesting to monitor going forward. And I haven't had the chance to like personally watch him a bunch, so I can't speak to how he looks on the screen per se. But overall, where he fits on this team right now, he's 7th on the team in BPR. But there, like I mentioned, there's a big drop between those top 5 players: Toussaint, Mitchell, Johnson, Stevenson, and Matthews, and the rest of the team in terms of their like predicted impact going forward. So he's kind of in that second tier of players there.
Okay. One transfer I want to hit on. Emmett Matthews is kind of a better version of who he was before. He maybe flourished in a more advanced offensive role at Washington. Trey Mitchell, out of a bad personal situation that led to his departure from Texas, closer to home, seems happy, very efficient offensive player, but he kind of came with that reputation. Eric Stevenson's the wild card, and I'm curious what you think about him because he's been in bad situations for basketball that he's talked about. Wasn't particularly happy at Wichita State, was on a bad team at Washington. He led the team in assists last year at South Carolina when he's probably a much better scoring option than a sister. And this just seems like nirvana for him, playing for a coach who lets him be himself. He's shooting a lot. However, in their 2 losses, they've been outscored by the exact amount of the points they were outscored when he was on the floor, which is a coincidence, but also perhaps telling. And I just can't figure it out about him because he's been in such a weird basketball journey, and maybe this is just right for him. But do the numbers back up what he's doing? Has he always had this capability just with bad surroundings? Is he performing above expectations? Please help me solve this riddle.
Yeah, so when in my transfer portal projections in the offseason, he was right outside the top 50 in projected transfer impact. So again, a solid piece added by West Virginia, and I think largely he's performed even better than expected in that regard. I think one of the most interesting pieces about him is when you look at his individual stats. I have a metric that basically quantifies how impactful a player is estimated to be based on just purely their individual stats. And when you look at his box offensive Bayesian performance rating, so it's box followed by Bayesian performance rating on either end for offense and defense, he's got the most impressive number on the entire team, which basically means if you were just looking at the individual box score stats for all the players on West Virginia, he would pop the most offensively. And I think that's largely been the case there. Obviously, leading the team in scoring at 14 points per game, shooting really well from the field, over 50% overall, over 45% from three, which is awesome to see. So yeah, I've been really impressed with him offensively. The team is playing well when he's on the floor as well. And defensively, he's been really solid too. So I'm really happy with what he's done so far.
Last question here, Evan. Preview us a little bit of what to expect, not where they're going to finish, what their record is, but you like to crunch lineup combinations and things that maybe have worked that could work some more. I believe you accurately predicted or called for a starting lineup change that ended up working out really well. Maybe you can wave that magic wand again here, but are there combinations? Is there a player? Are there lineups that you are impressed by so far, or that you would have reason to expect productivity from as West Virginia enters this behemoth in the Big 12?
Yeah. So one interesting thing to look at on my website is I have this page that looks at teammate chemistry. So particularly looking at every possible pair of players on a team, it looks at when they're on the floor together, how much better or worse than their averages do they play, both in terms of their like individual stats and how they impact overall team performance. And so when you look at the pairs of players who have the highest chemistry on the team, so these are guys who when they're on the floor, the team plays way better than expected, based on their individual averages. The highest, pair there in terms of chemistry is Emmett Matthews and Trey Mitchell. When they're on the floor together, the team is outscoring opponents by almost 40 points per 100 possessions. And the good news there is that they are already playing a lot together. So that there are a lot of, things like that West Virginia is already like employing. You have a pair of Emmett Matthews and Trey Mitchell who's already playing really well together and is being utilized a lot. So you can already start to ride that. The next pair is Trey Mitchell and Joe Toussaint, another pair that's been used quite a bit as well and has been really successful. So in that sense, like last year when we were talking, there was a lot of things that needed to be fixed or at least tweaked in terms of rotations, lineups, et cetera. There just wasn't a lot working for the team in mid-January last year. And obviously the rest of the season still was a struggle in that regard. A lot more optimism going forward because, there are a lot of things that are already working for this team and that they can continue to leverage. Sometimes, a warning sign for a team is when I look at some of these lineup pages and see some of the worst, combinations of players, whether that's two player pairs or lineups that are being used the most and are really bad. And West Virginia does not have many of those this year. So that's a really good sign already that they're already starting to, use players, use them together, figure out who works well together and what's going to make the team tick. So in that regard, there's, I think, not as much that quote needs to be fixed. A lot is already working really well for this team.
All right, I lied. Here's my last question. You come prepared, you do your homework. I don't want to leave anything on your notepad that you have worked up and not presented. Do you have any wisdom nuggets left for us here, or have you used them all in these 35 minutes?
No, we've pretty much covered it. I think you kind of know what to ask, and we make our way through it. So those are pretty much all my main points to cover.
All right, then we'll leave with this. Jalen Bridges coming to Morgantown early in Big 12 play. You are close to the Baylor program, education there. Still keep your eye on it. What's going on with Mr. Bridges in Waco?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if I have an answer to that per se. I think,
It's not bad
from
though.
a
It's not
bit.
bad.
No, it's not bad. He was a great piece for Baylor, and I think a Baylor team that lost, a lot of pieces from last year, several first round NBA picks, and trying to figure out how to form this team with the pieces they have alongside a prolific freshman in Keontae George. Jalen Bridges was supposed to be a piece that really fit in, and I still think going forward that he's going to be a big piece for them. I think despite somewhat disappointing numbers from him so far, especially in some of the bigger games that they've had, I still think that he's going to be a big piece for them going forward. He's still inside the top 200 in BPR in the nation. He's fourth on the team overall. So, I'm not really worried about him per se. And like with that being said, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. I think offensively he's been fine. I think defensively there have been some question marks for this Baylor team, not just him, but kind of across the board in terms of their consistency on the defensive end, which in previous years has been really reliable. And I think this year, just in terms of their personnel, is a little bit more of a worry. And I think he's not been quite as good on that end as he could be. So look for that to improve, but. I still think he's a really solid piece for Baylor. And if they continue to be good going forward into Big 12 play, I think he should be a part of that.
It's fascinating. He's 5 for 32 as we're talking here from 3 point range, 24 for 33 from 2 point range. He's added to his game a little bit in that regard inside the arc, which he probably had to do. So player development certainly is something he was looking for. Maybe he gets it there too. He is Evan Miyakawa, EVANMIYA.com, data analyst at Zealous Analytics. And of course, the purveyor of our favorite website here too, which now has a subscription level that is worth your time, worth your investment. Evan, you're very modest. You were not going to say anything that you didn't want to preview yet, but what you told me was very exciting. What may be coming here in the future. So people should keep an eye on your website, should they not?
Yeah, I guess the quick summary is that if you want to kind of get into all of this advanced metric stuff, quantifying player performance, looking at lineups, all that good stuff, I've got a subscription for $5 a month that you can access, and I've got some stuff that I'm cooking up that hopefully I'll have up in the next month or so. That is been in the works for a long time, a little bit more focused on the coaching side of things in terms of things like lineup optimization and keys to victory for specific to teams and things like that. I can't necessarily speak to all of those things yet, but there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon, so you can be looking for that in the near future.
You can't mistake it when you hear someone in a news conference talk about predictive analytics and not know where that came from. It comes from evanmia.com, pioneering in his field. The transfer portal is right up your alley too. So I'm really glad that you rode the wave at the right time here and people are taking notice. Evan, we can start Big 12 play now. We got this in the books. We are well versed on what to expect. Can't thank you enough for the time and happy holidays to you.
Yeah, hopefully the fact that we got this done before Big 12 play started is a good sign, because last year I know that we tried to get this done and it didn't happen until after a few games into West Virginia's conference slate, and we know how that turned out. So hopefully this is a different year for that reason.
I'm sure a lot of people will be joining you in that chorus there. Until next time, I'm Mike Kazaza. That is Evan Miyakawa. We will talk to you soon.